Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. So Monday was cataclysmic in Canadian politics, and I wanted to check in with a gentleman who I have a great deal of respect for. He's 4 decades in public affairs, polling, pollster, really has his finger and his nose on what's going on in Canada. John Wright. John, welcome to the show.
Great to be with you, Brian.
So, John, what's going to happen? Maybe we'll start with what you think's going to happen, and then go back and talk about what has happened. But this is probably the biggest political party crisis, prime minister crisis, government crisis since I don't know what Paul Martin and Jean Chrétien or Lucien Bouchard and Brian Mulroney. What do you think?
Well, I don't think I've ever seen a finance minister treat a prime minister in the way that this was dealt with. So I think you're right. It's probably the most cataclysmic event that we've seen affecting a prime minister when he's got a sitting cabinet minister who decides to ditch and run like that. Look, I think, there will be a lot of things that still are to come about leading up to why that happened. But I think going forward, it's very clear that while there was a nuclear bomb that went off on Monday morning, very timely, just before cabinet met, you noticed the day where the prime minister really didn't say anything, stayed inside the cabinet office, worked with some pretty close people within his office. So the world is falling apart and breaking apart outside the cabinet room, but he was able to, in a way, keep everything together. At the end of the day, you're still running a government. And it always amazes me how you can go through a day like this and then show up at caucus meeting a few hours later and look coiffed and calm and then walk out of the room and go on with the rest of your business. But it's clear what happened. They decided, look, we can't make any decisions now. We've got to get out of the House of Commons. And that's going to happen anyways, as it did, where they just ran out the clock. It just happened to be on the final day of the House the next day. So the prime minister didn't even have to show up. There was no confidence motion. There was nothing to approve. So you just let the clock run out after you've been in the caucus the night before. And then you have an announcement for border security that was going to be made anyways. So you need a finance minister, and you put in one of your most trusted people to be the finance minister. So that plugs that hole, and you've got an announcement coming up. The rest of the time, you're not in public view, but your ministers now are out, moving forward with the government. And effectively, the only other appearance you're going to put in outside of a fundraising dinner on that night after caucus is the Christmas party for the Liberals, which is on Parliament Hill tonight. And then you're going to take a vacation with your family and figure out what you want to do next. It was just interesting where all of this exploded. And I think if it had been a corporation, I think if it had been a publicly traded company, you would have had, the public affairs people saying, you've got to resign, you've got to go somewhere. There is no mechanism. There is no mechanism to kick the prime minister out unless there's an entire open revolt. And I think he held it all together to basically run out the clock, live another day. And we'll find out what happens probably in January. And I would say the next 24 hours will be a cabinet shuffle. Remember that all of those members that went into that caucus that night, there's about 65 of them that, have wanted the prime minister to go, but there's a lot of others who want to be cabinet ministers still. And as a result, we've still got a cabinet shuffle probably on Thursday. And then he'll go away with the family for, the Christmas break and decide then. So what seemed to be a nuclear warhead that was going to take out him and the government, in fact, within 24 hours, it seems that the page has basically changed.
Really? So he survives to live another day?
Well, yeah. And again, part of this, Brian, I think is just when you look at the sequence of the events, you and I would say, should he go? There's the first question. Should this prime minister go? Is he done? And the answer is yes to both. 80% of the public, and probably even more by the time we get to the polling that'll be released in the next couple of days, will say they want him gone. In all the polling that I've done in the last 3 months, it's shown that even in core cities across the country, they want him gone. Except that when you say someone else from the Liberal Party who might run in his place, you get about 30% of people saying, I'd take another look at that. So, the vote moves up. So he is the issue around all of this. So, they lost the British Columbia by-election. There's only 16% turnout.
It was like unbelievable. I've never seen a turnout that low.
Yeah, it was. Well, a lot of Liberals sat on their hands. They won the last vote by 32%, if I recall correctly, and this time they got 62% voted against them. But nonetheless, look, politics has been exhausted with the Liberal government. The question is, what are you voting for? And people there effectively do what they do when they want to throw a government out. They showed up to the polls to throw the government out. But in many ways, the by-election doesn't matter, because it's all going to hinge now on whether or not the government falls. And that could be any time between now and next summer. But the reality is that they could hold on possibly until October of this coming year, and that will be when time would be up with the NDP. But look, I think that if he really wanted to save the party, he'd come back in January. And I don't think he's going to save all of it, but he'd certainly give it a Hail Mary shot for a lot more seats than he currently has. I think he would announce in January that he was going to leave and have a leadership convention, and that he would go by March, which will allow the new prime minister to come in March and have a throne speech like Perot, and to have a throne speech and to do a budget and then spend a couple of months there. But that doesn't give very much time at all for a new government to be in place. So he really has left all of this right to the last moment.
How do you have a leadership convention in a minority parliament? Do you have to prorogue parliament for a long period of time to allow the leadership convention to take place, the leadership race and the convention to take place, and then also the new government to be formed before they come back for a speech from the throne?
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. Again, the prime minister and his party have no mechanism to oust the prime minister. This is not like British politics, and it's certainly not like the Chong Act that went into place for the Conservatives, where Andrew Scheer went into the cabinet after Aaron O'Toole had lost, and basically said to his colleagues, I think Aaron should go, and they basically ditched him. There's nothing like that in the Liberal Party. The second thing is that the government controls the House. Like they can prorogue, they can cause a new parliament to be enacted at a future date, and you can allow that time for a leadership convention to take place. So we live in a parliamentary system where there's not many controls on the leader of this party at the moment, nor the government. And so he can take his time to make his decision. But Brian, I tell you, the numbers, I haven't seen these numbers as bad as, Kim Campbell days, when they wiped out the Conservative Party and left two members in its place.
So I think that's an interesting analogy. Please remind us. So Brian Mulroney was way down in the polls and decided to call a leadership convention and and it was a full leadership convention. It wasn't handed to Kim Campbell, but she won. And then she was elected prime minister, and she governed for, what was it, a couple months?
Yep. It was there, and then called an election.
Lost, went down to 2 seats.
Yeah, just wiped them out. I mean, you have to remember, Brian Mulroney had brought in the GST, terribly unpopular, and a lot of people just had enough of the prime minister. He'd accomplished a lot, no question about it, but they'd had enough, and so he was on his way out the door. Now, when Kim Campbell won, I was doing the polling then for, I think it was CTV at the time, and she did get a bounce. There's no question that people rose to embrace her at the beginning, and then during the course of the campaign, there were a number of guffaws. The famous one being where she said that, it's no time to be having policy discussions, especially on social policy during an election campaign. I mean, it all of a sudden dropped the numbers very considerably because of the campaign, its efforts, and how she was being portrayed in the campaign. So they lost it. It was a very thin floor for them to be on. So the same will exist for, the Liberal Party. They're not going to come all the way down to 2 seats like they did with Elsie Wayne and Jean Charest. They were the only ones left standing at the end of the day. But they would probably at the moment hold on to about 40 seats, which is a huge defeat. It would give rise to a massive conservative government. And you'd be back to the Brian Mulroney days of what do you do with all of those members? How do you keep them busy? I remember those days very, very clearly. But then what it would do is likely put the Bloc Québécois as the official opposition. And you have to remember then that the next thing we would have to deal with is the Parti Québécois, who is leading in the polls at the moment and wants to have yet another referendum on separation sovereignty. You would replace the Trudeau Liberals in what exists today with a new parliament, with an opposition party headed up by the Bloc, with a majority government of the Parti Québécois in Quebec, and then wanting to have another referendum to leave to have sovereignty association. So, I mean, whatever is going to happen.
Doesn't sound like a much more stable environment for Canada.
Well, you know what? I don't know, except that, you know, one door closes and another one opens, and it's not going to be smooth sailing. On top of that, you know, we've got what's going to happen next door for the next 4 years with Mr. Trump, and every day is going to be a different revelation, you know, for what we should be looking at. So I don't even want to say buckle up, because that's just too simple a phrase, but we have a lot of turmoil to go through in the next 4 years, of which the Canadian political scene is going to have nothing but upheaval for about the next 48 months for sure.
It's going to be interesting. John Wright is here to break down what has happened over the course of the last several days and 24 hours. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back with John Wright in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. It's a real pleasure of mine to have John Wright, 4 decades in polling and public affairs and political knowledge and activism, not with a party, but out there trying to understand what's going on with us tonight to break down. John, let's take a step back if we could, and maybe you could remind people what's happened, because I think a lot of us sort of woke up Monday morning reading the news about what was happening, and we sort of didn't know what had happened. So roll back a week or so, if not a month or so, and tell us your perception of what's happening. Because my impression is that, you know, whether it was negotiations with a potential new finance minister, Mark Carney, or maybe it was disagreements between the current, the then current finance minister Chrystia Freeland and the PMO and the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Something was happening between the finance minister and the PMO before late last week, before the Zoom call that was described on Friday. Is that your sense?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely, you just described it. So there were 2 tracks probably headed in that direction. Number one was this desire, which has been telegraphed from a number of people associated with the government. I mean, Mr. Trudeau's never said that he isn't trying to recruit them, but you know how politics works, Brian. I mean, you get people in the Prime Minister's office who are leaking and saying things to the media. It's being reported. And I think what they wanted to do is to get Mark Carney, who was the former head of the Bank of Canada and then the head of the Bank of England, to come on board as a non-elected individual. And you can do that to become finance minister. You make them a member of the Privy Council and you can appoint them. And the rumor then was that Dalton McGuinty's brother, former premier, has a seat in Ottawa, and that they would make room for Mark Carney to go and get elected there. So that was, I think, their thinking. And the second thing was that you then have a finance minister who had a finance document, an update to put on the table in Parliament. And it's clear that while she had said that she wanted the government only to spend $40 billion more, I mean, this is a government that's never seen a balanced budget, enjoys spending a lot of money, but nonetheless said 40 billion was the guardrail where it was going to happen. Because you had things like Indigenous awards, you had some capital gains write-offs for business, and a series of other things. It got lumped in with what the deficit would normally have been, and it ended up being, at the end of the day, $62 billion instead of 40. They knew this was coming. So when you put all of that together, what you ended up having then was a bit of an internecine warfare where people started to say, look, she's not going to make her targets, and so she probably should go. Number two, we want to get somebody who can replace her and bring in Mark Carney. And they said that the Prime Minister had discussions then with Mark Carney. So this is all building, and you can see that the train's headed down the track to get her out of that position. And on Friday morning, I guess the prime minister had an hour-long call with the finance minister. And at the end of that call, after having reviewed all of the things that were for the economic statement, said, and by the way, I'd like you to take up another post, and that is to head up the Canada-U.S. relations file, but you wouldn't be finance minister anymore, and that we'd bring in somebody else, Mark Carney, to do it. And I think that was tactically one of the worst things you could do, because it gave the deputy prime minister, and who was also the finance minister, the weekend to think about this. She knew that there was a cabinet meeting going on at 9:30 on Monday morning. She knew that Sean Fraser, the former or the housing minister for the Maritimes, was going to make a statement and say that he was not going to run. And that's interesting, because he himself could be a candidate for leader. So at the end of his statement being telecast live with 10 minutes to go to cabinet, she dropped an incendiary letter that effectively said, I'm out. I'm not going to play political gimmicks anymore. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of money. She'd said the night, I think it was within the 48 hours previously, that the promise of the government to spend $5.5 billion and give everybody at a certain pay scale $250 would have added $5 billion, as I said, to the deficit. I think she said, enough is enough. I'm out. And said, I'm not going to be part of a government that just is about spending gimmicks. And at the time, we're running out of time, and we will inevitably not be in power anymore. That then triggered a broadside of the government where, cabinet was meeting at the time. And I think the prime minister addressed them, didn't rule anything in or out. And then almost all of the cabinet ministers left, and then some of the staffers came in, and they decided what they were going to do was to, wait out the day, not have him comment on this. So, I mean, that's my understanding from piecing together what we've been able to see in the media. The Globe and Mail had the lead on a lot of this stuff with Robert Fife, who was reporting it. And I think a lot of people then said, well, he's done. Like, he's going to go and see caucus and there'll be a revolt. Well, there were people who stood up against him, but a lot of people kept their powder dry. Again, there's a lot of cabinet ministers that have to be put in place. He had to get a finance minister in place. And so he picked Dominic LeBlanc, who's a long-standing friend and a maritime minister who's covered off so many different portfolios, to take the finance portfolio. And then he went to the Laurier Club that night and made a 7 or 8 minute speech where he said it'd been quite a day and wished them all well and have a great time and see you later. And then retired, was out of sight the next day because the House wasn't going to be sitting. And then you saw that the page starting to turn when by about 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the new finance minister, who was the security minister before, still has that title, met with Mark Miller, who is the immigration minister, and a couple of others, to announce some aspects that they were going to use for the border to appease Mr. Trump and the trade threats. And that has been in place for a while. It wasn't hastily conceived, but it just allowed the page to be turned. In fact, I watched it, and there were hardly any questions about Mr. Trudeau at the time. So what are we left with? Well, you got a caucus Christmas party that the prime minister will go to. And then after that, you've got a cabinet shuffle, probably in the next 24 to 40 days, January the 27th, and a prime minister who clearly wants to get out of town, grab his kids, his family, and go, and then decide what he's going to do.
Take a walk on the beach? Like
well,
his father took a walk on the snow?
It could be. Or Brian, you know what? I don't put anything past him. I mean, all of the polling shows that he's going to lose. Like if he ran anytime soon, he's going to. The NDP are not going to pull the stool out from underneath him. I mean, Jagmeet Singh was ridiculous the other day, calling on him to basically resign and keeping all the options on the table, not threatening to bring the government down, because their fates are tied together, right? They're tied in the polls. They'd both be wiped out. And so I don't know, I can foresee if he wanted to, he could end up at the inauguration in later January. Like he could go, he could be there on the 20th of January. Even President Trump in the last 24 hours put out a tweet saying that it's a darn good thing that Krista Freeland is gone because she was toxic. He didn't like her at all. Maybe this is a good thing for that relationship. But I can see him arriving in Washington with 2 or 3 ministers in tow for the inauguration, and it's still a week before Parliament is due back. So this prime minister is not gone yet. And he may not say anything until the end of January. So we'll just have to sit back and wait and see what he has. He has all the cards and all the marbles, but the only game in town is he loses. At the end, he loses. There's no question about it. It's just a matter of he holds the sand in the clock, I suppose you want to call it that.
Well, lots of people forget that Pierre Elliott Trudeau lost, Joe Clark won, and everyone thought that Pierre Elliott Trudeau was going to exit stage right and never return again. And it was less than a year later, he got elected to a majority government. And
yeah, I don't think that prospect is going to exist for his son. I think his son, the one thing is that there's never been a government since Mackenzie King back in the 1930s and early 40s that has lasted any more than 9 years. And we're at 9 years, and the public is finished with Mr. Trudeau. The second thing that we've seen is the campaign of demonization by the Conservatives. It's nonstop. I mean, if we get bad weather today, Mr. Trudeau will get the blame for that.
Just in weather, just inflation, just in weather.
Just in time, just in weather, whatever it is. And so he's done a very good job, because the question will be whether or not, if there is another leader, whether they will get a second chance. I don't doubt the Conservatives will get a majority, but it may be that at least the Liberals have enough members that they can rebuild and, have some representation across the country. At the moment, that's simply not going to be the case.
So, let's talk about timing then. So, many people think one of the problems that the Democratic Party and Kamala Harris had in the United States was that Joe Biden gave her too little time to get known by the population. But Doug Ford had, what was it, 40 days or something like that? So
yeah, but I think the difference between the two was, I was doing polling in the States at the time too. And I think what you have to do is you have to take the rhetoric of Donald Trump, all the stuff that people don't like to listen to if they don't like the tone, and just look at what he was talking about and what he was saying he was going to do. And that was to improve their economic situation, to plug the border, to extradite illegal immigrants, to give tax breaks. Like you may have disagreed on everything in how he was saying it, but there was a list that you could go through the checklist and put it there. Kamala Harris, on the other hand, spent $1 billion effectively saying, don't give power to that man because he might threaten our democracy. Okay. You can't eat that. You can't put that in your pocket. And it may be a threat to some people that they took seriously. But the reality was that it wasn't enough on that side of the ledger with that list of things that people wanted to do. And so there were people that didn't like Donald Trump who said, you know what, I'll take a chance. I would say this, Brian, the United States is the most incredible, resilient democracy in the world. Like when you think everything that country has gone through, even as long as I've been alive, assassination attempts, governments that have come and gone, a Trump presidency that lasted an entire term and went through everything it did on the Hill. It manages to survive. And Americans believe that, and they decided that they would do that they'd elect Mr. Trump, but they do know that they've got another 2 years and they can elect congressmen and senators to change the balance of that back. But he won clearly on not necessarily the message, but on the substance of what he was talking about.
Is the economy stupid?
Well, but the real issue then is, can that happen here in Canada? I don't think that you're going to have it happen to the same degree whatsoever. But if you were the head of the Liberal Party, your legacy at the end of the day is primarily going to be spending more money than any other government has in the history of this country, and probably in many more to come. Secondly, getting us out of COVID, which was an accomplishment in and of itself. And the third thing is driving the Liberal Party aircraft into a foggy mountaintop when you should have been on the ground and destroy, and getting it to say, is that the legacy that you want to leave? Because it's not climate change. it's going to be that. And I think if you had any semblance of history, I think you'd want to put the party and the country ahead of your own interests and line that up so that you could at least give your party a fighting chance to not get wiped out. At the moment, I can't predict whether that's going to go one way or the other.
But he's probably a lot like, people said Biden was before Biden finally gave it up, that he thought Biden thought he was the only one that could beat Trump. And don't you think Trudeau thinks he's the only one capable of beating Pierre Poilievre?
Yeah, I don't disagree with that analogy whatsoever. I don't. In both cases, they've decided to let the party potentially blow itself up and not have any room whatsoever to come back. And it may be, in fact, in Canada, if that were the case, it may be 2 whole terms. Again, remember that the Liberal Party is not on the scene. And in Ontario alone, they're running with 48%. The Conservatives are running at 48% of the vote, which just wipes out the Liberals. The reality then is that you get a government that is a massive majority, that has a massive mandate, is going to make some fundamental changes in this country, no question about it, but is also going to then be faced with a constitutional crisis at the same time that they may be dealing with Donald Trump in the United States. So it's from fat into the fire and then into another fire right after that.
We're going to take a break as we talk about running from fat in the fire to another fire. Great analogy for some messages, and take a breather. And then when I come back, I'm going to ask John about, has Chrystia Freeland destroyed her leadership ambitions, or some people think she's cemented her leadership positioning? What about Mark Carney? What about any other potential leadership aspirants? Does anyone have a chance? Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, chatting about what's happened with the Liberal Party and our government, and what's going on in Parliament Hill, and what's going to happen with Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister, and what's going to happen with all the other players, if anything. So, John, I got to ask you, just from a human resources or human relations standpoint, if I'm going to dump somebody, and before they get dumped, they're going to have to go out and make a major announcement. It's kind of a nice thing to do, to warn them that they're going to get dumped. But it's really dumb politics, isn't it?
Yeah, it was terrible. I mean, you basically are telling somebody to do a whole lot of things with a budget that they're going to have to take responsibility for. And I mean, a budget, it wasn't a budget. It was a budget statement, meaning, it was an update. It wasn't a budget that we would have in the spring, but she's managing a budget of the government. And because of a lot of the things that the PMO were saying that we want to do for electoral purposes, we want to spend more money, such as the $5 billion that would go towards the $250 checks for people across the country. I mean, she was pushing back on that. And she would have warned the $60 billion deficit, which was $20 billion more than what she said she wanted to have. So in the first thing, you're asking somebody to carry water that's not hers. It's the political people that are stoking this. The second thing is it must have been tremendously humiliating to be gaslit for 3 weeks beforehand. Can you imagine? It's not like you can just phone up the Prime Minister and say, "Hey, how are you doing?" I mean, there are cabinet ministers that rarely see the Prime Minister, get through to him. I mean, it's really hard to do that, but you have the second most powerful person in the country, the Deputy Prime Minister, and a Finance Minister, in fact, who is wanted by everybody because she's handing out money. I mean, it's very popular in a lot of places in the country to members that she's been able to do that for. But, gets told that she's now going to have effectively a role which will demote her. She won't be Deputy Prime Minister. She won't be Finance Minister. She'll be having a role with Canada-US relations. I don't think there was staff attached to that. I don't think there was a budget. And it's certainly, with the backdrop of she didn't go to Mar-a-Lago. She wasn't invited to that. Mr. Trump doesn't like her. So you kind of look at that pile of stuff that's sitting on your desk in that phone call. And it says, you know what? I'm also going to have you replaced with Mark Carney, who I've been wooing publicly for the last period of time and humiliating you as it goes along. See you later. Have a great weekend. I mean, what would you do?
So tell me, was Trudeau trying to be nice by giving her a heads up, or was he just being dumb about giving her a heads up and thinking that she was going to carry through?
I don't know, but you and I have been around politics for a long time, and I don't think. Look, I wouldn't have let my staff gaslight anybody like that. If you didn't want somebody to serve in the position, somebody you've had there after the first finance minister was gone, but for a long time, and if you've relied on them and you've got a statement coming up in the House that you know has got some kryptonite in it, I mean, you don't do this. I don't think that they ever expected her to go out the way she did.
Okay, so let's talk about her then for a second. You can quit, or you can quit with a really damaging letter. What do you think about her way out?
Well, I mean, it's real politics. And she has a book that was going to be out in February that's now coming out on Friday. If you want to run for some position in politics, you usually write a book or you have a book written about you and you can get out there. So she's going to have hers. I think her ambitions are to run for the leader of the party. So that will happen. And she got a standing ovation when she went into caucus. None of this suggests that she's got huge support. I mean, let's be clear. It's politics, but she believes that she should run, and she probably has lots of people who are supporting her to do that. I mean, other people who could run, Mark Carney himself might get his, name tossed into the ring, but Mark Carney said to the Prime Minister, on Monday, I don't want this job. See you later. I'll take my chances another time. But you've got Anita Anand, who's a former defense minister, who's sitting as transport minister and Treasury Board president. You've got someone like Sean Fraser, young, was immigration minister and housing minister, who is very forceful in the House and has been a great defender of the government. And he comes from the Maritimes where they need to pick up seats, and he's very young and charismatic, so it might be for him too. You're going to have a few others who are going to decide. Even Dominic LeBlanc, who is the current finance minister, might have a draft movement to put him there. So there are people, and I've probably left out a few, who could come into the party to run. But it's clear that at this stage, she was forced into a position that, what else are you going to do? So she decided to make this an incendiary blast. And I don't think that it's damaged her constituency within the party now, who don't want Mr. Trudeau around. In fact, they will gravitate towards her.
So you think she's helped her position with the anti-Trudeau crowd?
Oh, no question about it. And there's those who are, there's about 65 of them, I think they were saying in the last day or so, who are actually in the open market and talking about this. But that's about a third of caucus. So they would move towards her to somebody like that. And then there's another third that, probably might move somewhere. And then the last third who are, members of the government and not wanting to move really anywhere, and who are loyal to Mr. Trudeau. Look, politics is made for days exactly what we saw. I used to know Jim Flaherty. Jim Flaherty was a finance minister. I used to know him as a lawyer friend before he got into politics. And he did a lot of sailing out on Lake Ontario on his CNC 30. And I used to say, what's it like sailing? Because I don't know it. He'd say, hours of boredom followed by minutes of terror. And he also used to say, when I opened the fridge once, I looked there and there were 3 bottles of champagne. And I said, what are the 3 for? And he said, when you come second, you drink 1. When you come first, you drink 2. And when you come last, you drink all 3. That's politics, terror, and trying to figure out when and what you're going to celebrate at the time. All we know is this: the Prime Minister is still in control of the government and his position as Prime Minister. He has time, at least until January the 27th, when the House returns. And that's a week after Donald Trump is sworn in. And he's got a new cabinet, and he's got what he may have as a belief that he can still fight some battles, and maybe his goal is to make a deal with Donald Trump and save Canada from a bunch of other things. Who knows? But he's got time. The question, though, is, does the Liberal Party have time? every day that they miss is a day that you look at and say, I don't think they do anymore. Mm-hmm.
So you talk about, does the Liberal Party have time? Mark Carney, just for a second, if there was a leadership convention, there was a good chance he would have of winning that leadership convention, just based on his resume and reputation and the fact that he's been recruited. You know what? Even if you got to be prime minister for 2 months, you'd live in the history books forever. Wouldn't anyone want that opportunity?
Oh yeah. Look, first of all, I don't think Mark Carney is going to be anywhere close to that. At the end of the day, as you know, Brian, because you've been to these things, it's about who sells the memberships, right? It comes down to that. It's not about whether, you ran a Bank of Canada or England or you're a fine, upstanding fellow. You better have a team that can go out and sell memberships and get you the votes that you need. I don't think he can do that. Number
But the
two,
Liberal Party today in leadership, you don't have to sell memberships. You just have to join. It doesn't cost you anything. So you have to get people to join.
Yeah, you know
so
what?
It's more like a U.S. primary in that regard.
Well, you have to join, but you want to encourage more people to join, correct?
But you don't have to sell that $10 or $20 membership anymore. So it's not, but you do have to take out a membership. So it's more like registering for the Democrat or Republican Party and then get the vote out. So it's a little bit more like a primary.
I understand what you're saying. The reality is, though, that you don't just kind of leave it open. Let's be clear. When I say, you have to get the votes, meaning that you got to get enough people who join the party for you in order for them to vote for you. This is not.
So you don't think he'd win? You don't think he'd win in a leadership?
No, not at all. No, I don't think so. I think that there's too many people who might look at them and say that, he's just an outsider. He's not somebody who's come to the game. And what does he bring? I mean, do you think that he could out membership support for any of the candidates that I just mentioned? I mean, Sean Fraser, Anita Anand, all these people who've been around. I mean, I think that the Liberal Party is not going to be saved by an outsider. It's not going to be saved.
Michael Ignatieff just visiting all over again.
Well, but that's the point. And, the Liberals were not, many in the Liberal hierarchy were not satisfied until they had the reincarnation of Pierre Elliott Trudeau. And if you look at the personalities who have been in that role, that's kind of what they've tried to get over all these years. I think that this is time for a great renewal, but I think they're going to have to suffer a great defeat in order to come back and rebuild. The young people who are now in their mid-20s and early 30s will be in their 40s and, getting ready to run and manage the party a decade from now. I think that's the generation that's going to have the most influence, not the one that's there now.
Okay, you're probably right, but let me just challenge you for a second. If you were any company in this world, or Canada for sure, and your board had a recruiting committee and they were recruiting the CEO, particularly in a major time of global unrest and financial challenges with your major trading partner, Mark Carney and his resume would be your first choice before any of the other people you mentioned.
It's not a board, and I would completely disagree. I mean, look, your shareholders are the electorate. Your shareholders are the public. I mean, you can have the best resume in the world, and they're going to kick your ass out the door if they don't like you. This is not necessarily about negotiating with Donald Trump, although it will come with the turf. No question about it. This is the survival of the Liberal Party. That's what this is about. I mean, you have 4 years to deal with Mr. Trump. The reality is that if you're going to end up with 40 seats versus 90 or 100 seats, you got a chance to at least have your feet on the ground in different parts of this country. I think there are candidates on the inside of the tent who will want this way more than they do for Mark Carney. Number two, those people who have seen what has just happened will say that Mark Carney was an outsider that effectively helped blow off a finance minister. And I just don't think he's got it. Like, he was out for the, I think it was the Stampede that he was out kind of making himself known. And he was wearing an Edmonton Oilers sweater, and he did an ad that basically say, "I'm with you." And he held up a Budweiser beer can and smiled and said, I'm out here for you guys in the West and all that. My son walked over and he looked. I said, "What do you think of this ad?" He looks at it and goes, "Dad, he's still got the cap on the beer." Like he hadn't even pulled the beer, like it was a Budweiser beer. He hadn't even pulled the top off of it. I mean, he doesn't fit politics. He's a wealthy, elite guy who people will not relate to at all. He doesn't have the political base, and he's just played a role in blowing up, the government of the day because he was the one being wooed to come into this place. No, I don't think he's got any hope at all. Not at all. I think you're looking at a different crew of people, but you may not be looking at any of them if this prime minister decides that he's going to take it right into the foggy mountain wall.
Let's talk about this prime minister then. You've negotiated with some tough people, and some people describe the former president-elect Trump as a bully, and believe the only way to combat a bully is to stand up to a bully and fight. Other people say, well, no, he's a narcissist, and the only way to negotiate with a narcissist is to fly down to Mar-a-Lago and feed his ego. It would appear, if he's calling Chrystia Freeland toxic, that frankly, being the stand-up bully to him may not work, and that Trudeau's going down and trying to placate him and feed his ego is the right strategy. So, what's the right strategy? Who's the right person? Is Trudeau actually the better person? The better negotiator with Trump right now?
When I grew up, they were playing the first runs of Star Trek. Like that's how old I am. That I used to come home from school and watch Star Trek, and they used to be the original versions for the first time. I think the first one I saw was the Horta. So go look that up in the history books. But Mr. Spock played three-dimensional chess, and I think that's what you basically have to do here. I think you've got the premiers across the country that are playing on one level. The federal government today that responded to the issue that was put forward, and that was border security and fentanyl. I mean, they're playing the puck, not the man. And then you had the prime minister who went down and who talked to the president-elect, which was a smart move, and he took the current finance minister down with him at the time. So there was a relationship built with the people around him. I mean, this is not a transactional person. This is somebody that's going to play in a whole bunch of different fields. So I don't know what the best approach is to this. All I know is that Team Canada is really made up of a real team hockey team. I mean, they're not all forwards. You got to have a goalie. You got to have defense players. You got to have a fighter. You got to have a peacemaker. You got to have a captain, 2 assistants. That's what a team is all about. So when Doug Ford dons his cape as Captain Canada and decides he's going to shut off some lights in Michigan, he knows that he's talking to the governor of Michigan, who will go and speak to the Trump administration, even though she's a Democrat. But I mean, you're putting pressure in different areas, and you're aligning your troops to do battle. I don't know what will actually come of all of this, but I do know that I think we're playing three-dimensional chess, and I think that's the only way in which you can deal with Donald Trump.
You're undoubtedly right. I do think that being toxic and being a bully to someone like that's some people call a narcissist, is the wrong strategy. And so I do think that the prime minister going down to Mar-a-Lago was unquestionably the right strategy. And I think that numerous different people that have played that strategy in the Republican Party and elsewhere have taught us that that's the right strategy, and it's worked for them. Okay, so you're advising Pierre Poilievre today. Do you just sit back and let the Liberal Party kaboom itself?
Well, you never get in the way of a man who set himself on fire in the middle of a stage, right? Like, he is going to continue to remind us every single day that Justin Trudeau and the carbon tax, and I mean, you and I can deal with the rhetoric of what a conservative ad would be today. We know it off by heart. The only question in my mind is whether or not when he gets into power, this is not unlike the first term of Brian Mulroney, where you've got so many people that you have to manage this in a very, very careful fashion. What happened in those first years, you probably would remember 1984, when the first massive majority came in, was that he took, who was it? It was Eric Nielsen. Leslie Nielsen's brother, the comedian. Eric Nielsen was from the Yukon, I think, and he put him in charge of going and studying what they could actually do in terms of making policies to reduce the deficit, to take a whole series of steps, to align ministries in a way in which would be the most effective. I mean, once you get a hold of this beast called government, you're going to end up with a period of time where we'll be treated to the horror of all horror shows, because for months they'll be, tearing back some curtain saying, oh my God, you won't believe what we found back there. Oh, yeah, they spent this, they did this. So we'll have all of that. But the plan for what the Poilievre government wants to do, there'll be a short term and then another period of time where they have to start to wear the government. They will blame inevitably the Liberals for the time that they're off.
As long as they can.
We're just trying to correct this, but they're going to have to manage it. It's not going to be a small group of people, and they're going to have their own explosions along the way. But nonetheless, they're going to hit the ground running, and they're going to make a lot of changes. And I think they're going to make a lot of them right off the bat that are symbolic. And if I were CBC, I would be prepared that you're going to get money rolled out of that. I think there's going to be some big changes. And I think the economy will be one of them where they are going to try and, let's put it this way. Some of the things like capital gains taxes, I mean, they're going to roll that back in order to invite investment into this country. Right? Like you can't have that going south of the border. You got to have it here. So there's a whole range of things that are going to happen. So the advice to him, stay at it. I won't suggest that he become a kinder, gentler guy, even though he's going to win anyways. But the reality is that he's got to keep going and be prepared and make it look as if he's got a government in waiting. Right now he's still campaigning, and maybe that's the turn where you have to say, I've got the shadow cabinet. I'm ready to go. We are ready to take government the first day that we arrive. Because really, when you're into this next year, it's predictable that by October, it's all gone anyways. And so you might as well say for the next 7 months, we're prepared. We're ready to go. Got all our people, and we're ready to make the big changes.
I interviewed a pollster from Quebec last week, and he, similarly to what you just said a couple minutes ago, thought the PQ, the Parti Québécois, was leading the polls and was going to win. The only, however, with that was Pablo Rodriguez and how he might improve the Liberals' prospects, but thought the PQ would win. And you've said the Bloc Québécois in a conservative majority will likely be the official opposition. What's the prospect for Canada?
Well, you got three things we're going to deal with. Number one is Mr. Trump right off the bat. And we're going to deal with some of those issues that we now know we have time. Isn't that amazing? It's not like the first day of the inauguration and you suddenly find out you're dealing with this. We've been able to ramp up towards it. But, Donald Trump's presidency is going to be just like it was the last time. Every couple of days, it's just going to be like zapping the world with whatever he wants to do. So we better be prepared for that. Number two, Quebec. We're going to shift from the oil patch in the West and all the conservatives that wanted Justin Trudeau out to, looking at Quebec and having to deal with potentially another referendum. And thirdly, we're going to have to restructure the economy. And I think that's the bigger issue where, you're looking at a 69-cent dollar today, which no doubt has been hit because of what's happened in the last 24 hours with the finance minister changing. But also we need investment and we need to restructure how we spend this money because it's not sustainable. It just is not the way it's going right now. And the biggest undercurrent for all of this is people like me. I'm starting a podcast with my son. Can you believe that? The podcast is called something to the effect of Wright, or something like that. He's a Gen Z, and there's 24% of the population represented by boomers and 18 to 20% represented by him. And we're going to sit down and talk about the differences between us. And I will tell you this much, that between now and 2041, it's my old folk friends and I who are going to be the biggest drain on the national finance and the healthcare system and everything else. And that's the undercurrent of all of this is we're going to have a shift in dynamics in terms of the demographics in this country. So that's the third challenge because we're not going to be able to keep up with that. And at the same time, we are going to need more people because from immigration, because we only have 1.4 babies. We're about a half a baby. We're just over half a baby short in order to keep growing. So underneath all of this is the demographic issue, which is going to pinch us all the way along right up until after 2046.
John Wright, fascinating conversation. Really appreciate you chatting with us tonight.
It's a pleasure, Brian. Thanks so much for having me.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. I think we're in for a ride in 2025 for sure, and over the course of the next couple of weeks as we wait to see what happens in Ottawa. Does the Prime Minister take a walk in the snow, walk on the beach like his father did, and resign? Does he stick it out and fight another day? I don't know. All bets are off. It'll be interesting to watch. And you know what? For a news junkie like me, it'll be fun because I've been too focused on CNN and what's going on in the United States in the last couple of months. I've been watching nonstop the insiders and talking about what's going on in Canada in the last little while. So it'll be good for my focus on Canadian politics. Thanks everyone for joining us. John Wright, always a pleasure, sir.
Take care. Good night.